My name is Camilla, and I'm 58 years old. The night my father disowned me, I cried myself to sleep. The next morning, I found the letter my mother hid before she died, and by the time I finished reading it, I realized my father's entire fortune legally belonged to me. The day my father told me, "You don't deserve a cent from me," was the day something inside me broke, and something else woke up. I've lived most of my life in the shadow of my father, Gerald Whitmore, a man who built an empire from nothing but treated his family like extensions of his brand. To outsiders, he was charming, the kind of man who could command a room with a handshake and a story about his humble beginnings. But behind closed doors, he was cold, calculating, and cruel in ways that didn't leave bruises, but left scars that never faded. I was his firstborn, his only daughter, and yet somehow I was never enough. I grew up in a mansion filled with marble floors and empty affection. My father didn't talk to me unless it was to point out something I'd done wrong, a dress too cheap, a boyfriend beneath our name, or an opinion too emotional for business. My younger brother Patrick was the opposite, the golden child, the future of Whitmore real estate. He got the cars, the vacations, and the applause at every dinner table. When he failed, Dad called it a learning experience. When I failed, Dad called it proof you'll never be capable. Mom used to be my safe place. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and full of quiet intelligence that my father constantly overshadowed. She used to tell me, "Don't let him decide your worth, sweetheart." But 5 years ago, when she passed away, that comfort disappeared. Her death broke something in our family, and my father didn't even let me grieve properly. He arranged everything, down to the flowers and the seating. I wasn't even allowed to pick out the casket. He said, "You'll only make it sentimental," as if loving my mother too much was a flaw. After that, I distanced myself. I built a modest life teaching design at a local college, living in a small house that was entirely my own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, and more honest than anything my father ever gave me. Then, a few months ago, he summoned us for a family meeting. When my father used that term, it wasn't about togetherness. It was about control. He wanted everyone in the same room to witness his dominance. The meeting took place in his office, a grand space with mahogany walls and oil paintings of himself. Patrick sat beside him like an obedient soldier, and my stepmother, Vivian, looked on with that smug satisfaction she wore like perfume. Vivian was my mother's former secretary. Dad married her a year after Mom's funeral. She's younger than me by 10 years and loves reminding me of it. Every time she calls me dear, it sounds like an insult dipped in sugar. I sat there, hands folded, trying to prepare for whatever announcement he had planned. Dad leaned back in his chair, adjusted his tie, and said, "It's time to discuss the future of the Whitmore legacy." He glanced at Patrick, pride radiating from his eyes. "I've decided that Patrick will take full control of the family trust fund and all related assets. He's earned it." My chest tightened. "And what about me?" He didn't hesitate. "You don't deserve it, Camilla. You've never earned my respect. You've chosen to waste your potential on art classes and charity work. That's not what this family stands for." I felt the words slice through me. Vivian smiled faintly, as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment. Patrick shifted awkwardly, but didn't speak. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him how I'd spent years trying to gain even a fraction of his approval. But the room was heavy with silence, the kind that tells you no amount of pleading will change the verdict. Then, as if to twist the knife deeper, he added, "This isn't personal, it's practical. Patrick understands business. You understand feelings, and feelings don't build empires." Vivian laughed softly. That was when I realized the meeting wasn't just about inheritance, it was a performance, a public execution of my dignity. I stood up, voice trembling but firm. "You'll regret this." He smirked. "The only thing I regret is ever thinking you could handle responsibility." That moment burned into my memory. I walked out of that office without looking back. Outside, the air felt different, colder, sharper. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. That night, I sat on my porch under the quiet hum of the streetlights, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I felt something stronger, a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. All my life, my father controlled everything, what I wore, what I studied, how I was seen. But in that moment, I decided something he could never control. I would prove him wrong. Not by begging for his approval, but by taking back what he stole from me: respect, dignity, and the legacy my mother intended for me. As I went to bed, the wind rustled through the trees outside my window, and I could almost hear my mother's voice whisper, "Don't let him decide your worth." I didn't know it yet, but she had left something behind, something hidden that would soon change everything I thought I knew about our family, and about who truly deserved the Whitmore fortune. What my father didn't know was that Mom had left something hidden, and it would soon make me the rightful heir to everything he held dear. A week after that cruel family meeting, I found the letter my mother had written before she died, and it contained a secret my father never wanted revealed. I hadn't been back to my childhood home since Mom's funeral. After she passed, Dad locked the place up like a museum, only using it for showings when he wanted to impress potential clients. But now a realtor had contacted me to ask if I'd remove any personal belongings before the property was repurposed. That was my father's word for erased. I drove there on a Sunday afternoon, unsure what I was looking for, maybe closure or just a piece of her that still felt real. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Every photograph, every framed diploma, every tiny decoration looked like it was waiting for someone to come home who never would. I wandered into her bedroom. It still looked untouched, the lace curtains she loved, the vanity with her brushes still neatly arranged, and her jewelry box, a small cherrywood chest with golden hinges. I used to play with that box when I was little, pretending I was some kind of princess. But now it just looked like another relic of a happier time. When I opened it, most of her jewelry was gone, probably taken by Vivian, who once accidentally referred to the box as hers. But as I lifted one of the drawers, I noticed something strange. The bottom wasn't flat. There was a tiny gap, just wide enough to slip a fingernail under. I hesitated, then pried it open. Beneath it lay a sealed white envelope, its edges yellowed with time. Across the front, in her soft cursive handwriting, were the words, "For Camilla, when you're ready." My heart pounded so hard it felt like my body already knew what my mind couldn't yet comprehend. I sat on the edge of her bed, holding the letter like it was made of glass. I could still smell her perfume on it. With trembling hands, I opened it. "My dearest Camilla," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and your father has likely told you you're not worthy of the Whitmore name. Don't believe him. You were always the best part of me, the part that saw people for who they were, not for what they had." Tears blurred my vision, but I kept reading. She explained how she'd quietly set aside a portion of her own inheritance, money she'd received from her grandmother's estate before marrying Dad. She wrote that she'd invested it carefully, growing it through the years, and created a trust account in my name. "You won't be able to access it until you're 58, she wrote, "because I wanted you to have it when you were old enough to see your worth without needing anyone else's approval." My throat tightened. I had just turned 58 a few months ago. She went on to mention her attorney, Nancy Rourke, who had been instructed to release all documentation to me and me alone. "Your father knows nothing about this," she warned. "If he ever did, he would try to take it from you. Guard this information carefully, my love." When I finished reading, I just sat there, the silence pressing down on me. My mother had trusted me enough to protect something huge, something my father would never forgive her for doing. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and took a picture of it for safety. Then I searched online for Nancy Rourke. She was still practicing, in her mid-70s now, running a small but reputable firm downtown. I called her office that same afternoon. When her assistant put me through, Nancy's voice was calm but cautious. "Camilla Whitmore," she said softly, as if the name carried history. "Your mother told me you'd call one day. I'm so glad you finally did." My hands shook as I told her about the letter. "She said there's a trust in my name." There was a pause. "Yes," Nancy said, "and it's time you knew the truth. The trust exists, and it's substantial, far more than you might expect." She asked me to meet her in person the next day. When I arrived, she greeted me with kind eyes and a folder thick with paperwork. She explained that the trust had grown over decades, invested in stable real estate and stocks. The balance was in the millions. I remember whispering, "Millions?" in disbelief. Nancy nodded. "Your mother was meticulous. She wanted to make sure you'd never need to depend on your father for a single thing." It felt surreal, like the world had tilted. The man who spent my entire life telling me I'd never deserve a penny didn't even know I already had more than he could imagine, and it was all because of the woman he'd dismissed as weak. Nancy leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Camilla, I must advise you. Do not tell your father yet. He will try to interfere, and though he has no legal authority over this trust, his influence could make things difficult until the final transfer is complete." I nodded, the weight of it all sinking in. Shock slowly turned into something sharper. Determination. My mother had believed in me enough to secure my future behind his back. She had fought him in silence, leaving behind not just wealth, but proof that she knew what he would try to do. As I left Nancy's office, the city lights blurred through the windshield as I drove home. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of power that wasn't borrowed, begged for, or stolen. It was mine, and it had been waiting all along. But I also knew my father. He had spies in every corner, and secrets in his world never stayed hidden for long. I thought I could simply collect what my mother left me and quietly move on with my life. But when Dad found out about the letter, all hell broke loose. The moment my father discovered my mother's trust, he didn't act like a parent. He acted like a man at war. It started with a call from Nancy, my mother's lawyer. Her tone was sharp, controlled, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "Camilla," she said, "we may have a problem. Someone from your father's legal team reached out this morning, asking questions about a potential unauthorized trust transfer." "They shouldn't even know this exists." I froze. "Unauthorized?" I repeated. "Yes, that's their word, which means they know something. Maybe not everything, but enough to start trouble. You need to prepare yourself. Gerald never plays fair." My chest tightened. How could he have found out so quickly? I had told no one. Nancy and I had been discreet with every step, but my father's reach extended everywhere. Bankers, lawyers, even private investigators. Nothing stayed secret long when his pride was involved. 2 days later, I got a letter delivered by courier. The envelope bore the letterhead of Hayes and Carlton, my father's longtime law firm. Inside was a thick packet of documents stamped urgent, legal notice. The letter accused me of attempting to transfer assets belonging to the Whitmore family estate under fraudulent pretenses. It demanded immediate disclosure of any and all documents relating to the alleged trust created by the late Mrs. Whitmore. I could practically hear his voice in those words, cold, arrogant, dripping with condescension. My hands trembled as I held the papers. He wasn't just angry, he was trying to destroy me legally. That night, just after sunset, I heard pounding on my front door. My stomach sank even before I opened it. There he was, Gerald Whitmore, towering, red-faced, every bit the powerful man he wanted the world to see. But this time, the mask was slipping. "Where is it?" he barked the moment I opened the door. "Where is what?" I asked, though I already knew. He stormed into my house without waiting for permission, slamming the door behind him. "Don't play games with me, Camilla. I know your mother hid something. You think you can steal what's mine?" "It's not yours," I said quietly. "It never was." His face twisted. "That money was family money. She had no right to move it without my consent." I met his eyes, and for once, I didn't look away. "She didn't need your consent, Dad. It was her inheritance, her name, her bloodline, not yours." He stepped closer, so close I could smell the cologne I'd hated since childhood. "You always were just like her, soft, naive, and look where that got her." I flinched, the words hitting harder than I expected, but then something inside me hardened. "You're right," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I am like her, and you know what she gave me that you never could?" He sneered. "What's that?" "Faith. She believed in me, even when you didn't." He glared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch in his cheek. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. The next day, my phone rang. It was Patrick. "Camilla, what are you doing?" he demanded before I could even speak. "Dad's losing his mind over this. You're being greedy. Mom's money was meant for the family." I took a deep breath. "I am family, Patrick. Or did you forget that part?" He scoffed. "You've always been jealous, haven't you? You couldn't stand that Dad trusted me." "No, Patrick," I said quietly. "I couldn't stand that you never saw what he really was." He hung up on me. Within days, the rumors started. Vivian, ever the puppeteer, told anyone who'd listen that I'd manipulated Mom before she died, that I'd taken advantage of her fragile state to get her to sign things she didn't understand. Nancy and I spent hours poring over the original trust documents, preparing for the inevitable storm. "He's going to challenge it," she said. "He'll claim your mother was mentally unfit when she established the trust. It's the oldest trick in the book." "Can he win?" I asked. She looked up from the papers, her gaze firm. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Your mother's documentation is ironclad. Dates, witnesses, certified medical records. She covered every angle. Your father has no legal standing." Still, I could tell she was worried, because this wasn't just about law. It was about power, and my father had always known how to wield it. In the weeks that followed, I watched as he threw everything he had into fighting me. His lawyers filed motions, his accountants dug through records, and his pride turned into obsession. I realized something then. He wasn't just trying to protect money. He was terrified of losing control. Control over the family name, over his image, and most of all, over me. He'd built an empire on the belief that he could shape everyone around him to his will. But now I was the one person standing outside his reach, and he couldn't bear it. One evening, as I sat by my window, going through another round of legal papers, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Crescent Bank, where Mom's trust was held. The subject line made my breath catch. Confidential notice. Change of beneficial authority. I opened it, and my eyes widened. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was my mother's final move, the part of her plan that no one, not even Nancy, had seen coming. Then, out of nowhere, I received a confidential notice from the bank, and it contained my mother's final revenge plan. When I opened that envelope from the bank, I discovered I wasn't just my mother's beneficiary. I was the executor of a clause that would decide my father's fate. It arrived in a crisp white envelope stamped with the seal of Crescent Bank Private Holdings, the same bank that handled my mother's investments. Inside was a letter from the Trust Management Department, written in formal, almost sterile language. But what it said made my pulse quicken. The document confirmed the existence of a contingent clause my mother had built into the trust. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that upon my father's death, incapacity, or breach of fiduciary ethics, full control of all family holdings associated with my mother's estate would automatically transfer to me. At first, I didn't understand. The phrasing was dense, the legal terms overwhelming, but as I read it again, slowly, I realized what it meant. My mother had quietly tied her assets to the company in a way that gave her a say in its fate, even after death. I called Nancy immediately. "Did you know about this clause?" I asked, voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No," she admitted. "But I'm not surprised. Your mother was strategic. She must have had reason to believe your father would mishandle her share of the estate. She made herself a joint owner," I said, almost in disbelief, "of the core business assets, the commercial properties, the primary development portfolio, everything tied to the Whitmore brand." Nancy exhaled slowly. "That means part of the company technically belonged to her, and now it belongs to you." My father had built his identity around total ownership. To him, control wasn't just power, it was proof of existence. And now, that foundation was legally fractured. Half of his empire was no longer his. Nancy's tone shifted. "Camilla, this clause gives you the right to send a notice of beneficial succession. It's a formal declaration stating that you are now the sole inheritor of your mother's joint holdings. Once it's filed, there's no going back. Your father will be legally bound to recognize you as a controlling beneficiary." I sat there in silence, my mind spinning. The document in my hands wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon. If I filed it, my father would lose control of a substantial part of his empire. His name would no longer carry absolute authority. He'd have to answer to me. But if I didn't, he'd continue to dominate, to manipulate, to pretend my mother and I never mattered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window, the moonlight stretching across the room, and read my mother's letter again. Her words echoed in my mind. You were always meant to stand tall, Camilla. Stand tall. Was this what she meant? Was this her way of making sure he'd never erase me, or her? By dawn, I had made up my mind. At 9 a.m., I met Nancy at Crescent Bank. We sat in a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. A senior bank officer joined us, confirming my identity and reviewing the legal documents. The process felt surreal, quiet, clinical, and yet deeply emotional. This is the official transfer form, the officer explained, sliding a single page across the table. By signing, you acknowledge full beneficial succession of the listed assets. Once notarized, these shares and holdings will be registered under your authority. My hand hovered over the line. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I thought of all the years my father had made me feel small, the way he'd looked through me instead of at me, the words he'd used to reduce me to nothing. And I thought of my mother, planning this in secret, trusting me to finish what she started. With a deep breath, I signed my name, Camilla Whitmore. The officer notarized it, stamped the papers, and extended a hand. Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore. You are now the principal beneficiary of your mother's estate holdings. It was done. Legally, irrevocably done. When I walked out of that building, the sun felt different, warmer, sharper. I clutched the envelope containing the notarized notice like it was both armor and fire. That evening, I printed the official Notice of Beneficial Succession addressed to Whitmore Real Estate Holdings, Inc. It bore my mother's trust reference, the corporate registration numbers, and my signature. I slipped it into a certified mail envelope, sealing it with shaking hands. Before I sent it, I received a text from Patrick. Camilla, please don't do this. You'll ruin everything. Dad's not well. You're pushing him too far. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed a single response. He ruined everything long before I did. I turned off my phone, walked to the nearest post office, and handed the envelope to the clerk. Certified delivery, I said quietly. As the clerk stamped it, I felt a strange mix of triumph and terror. I wasn't just signing a document, I was changing the entire balance of power in our family. On the drive home, I thought again of my mother's last words, stand tall. I whispered them aloud, gripping the steering wheel. I'm standing, Mom. Finally. That night, I placed a copy of the notice on my kitchen table and stared at it until exhaustion finally pulled me to sleep. But peace never lasts long in the Whitmore family. The next morning, my phone began buzzing nonstop. Messages from Patrick, emails from the company, and finally, one text from an unknown number. It read, You've made a terrible mistake. My father had received the notice, and his response was darker than I ever imagined. I thought the legal notice would end things peacefully. Instead, it set off a storm that nearly destroyed us all. The day after my father received the notice of beneficial succession, his office went into chaos. Employees whispered in the halls, the company's phone lines buzzed nonstop, and my inbox filled with messages from executives demanding clarification. I ignored most of them. I knew what was coming, the explosion. By noon, he called for an emergency board meeting at the Whitmore headquarters. The message he sent was short and furious. Be there. You've got explaining to do. I showed up accompanied by Nancy, calm and composed in her charcoal suit. She carried a leather briefcase containing every certified document related to the trust. I, on the other hand, carried the weight of decades of silence that was about to end. When we entered the conference room, the air was electric with tension. My father was already there, pacing at the head of the long glass table. Patrick sat beside him, jaw tight. Vivian stood near the window, pretending to check her phone, but her expression betrayed her nerves. The moment I stepped in, Dad slammed his palm on the table. You've gone too far, Camilla, he shouted. You forged that document. You think you can walk in here and steal my company? I didn't flinch. I didn't forge anything, Dad. Everything I've done is legal. It's your arrogance that made you blind to the truth. He threw a folder across the table. You expect anyone to believe that your mother, had the intelligence to set this up. My hands tightened around my chair, anger rising in my throat. Don't insult her memory just because she was smarter than you gave her credit for. Before he could retort, Nancy spoke. Mr. Whitmore, she said coolly, the trust documents are authentic and certified. We have notarized seals, dated bank records, and state filings confirming Camilla's status as the legal beneficiary and shareholder. I advise you to stop making accusations that could qualify as defamation. He froze mid-sentence, his face reddening. Around the table, the board members began to whisper. Nancy opened her briefcase and laid the evidence out one piece at a time. Copies of the trust deed, legal correspondence from Crescent Bank, the beneficiary notice stamped and verified. Each document landed like a hammer on stone. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Finally, Mr. Grant, one of the senior board members, cleared his throat. If these documents are accurate, he said cautiously, then Ms. Whitmore now holds controlling interest. 51% of the voting shares, correct? Nancy nodded. Correct. That figure includes the holdings previously co-owned by the late Mrs. Whitmore. Every head in the room turned toward me. My father's lips parted slightly. His confidence faltered for the first time. He looked older in that moment, smaller. The kind of man who'd spent his entire life building walls only to realize they were made of glass. Patrick slammed his fist on the table. This is insane. She's manipulating Mom's memory for her own gain. Patrick, I said quietly, I'm not manipulating anything. Mom made her choice long before she died. She knew exactly what she was doing. He started to protest again, but one of the board members interrupted. Gerald, the man said carefully, if these holdings are valid, company law requires that Camilla be recognized as the majority stakeholder. We can't ignore this without legal exposure. The words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, but Vivian gently touched his arm, her painted smile faltering. I saw it, the fear in her eyes. She was already calculating how to protect herself. My father sat down heavily, his breath shallow, his eyes darting between me and the papers in front of him. For once, he had no words. That day, I was officially recorded as the majority shareholder and acting chairperson of Whitmore Real Estate Holdings. It wasn't a victory I celebrated. It felt too heavy, too surreal. But as the signatures were inked, I felt something shift. The balance of power had changed forever. Over the next few weeks, I began working through the company files. What I found horrified me. Years of hidden debts buried under shell companies. Dozens of unpaid employees silenced with non-disclosure agreements. Real estate projects funded through unethical partnerships that my father had personally approved. For decades, he'd hidden corruption behind charisma. And now, it was all unraveling. I didn't want to destroy his empire. I wanted to cleanse it, to restore the name my mother once believed in. But every discovery chipped away at the image I'd grown up with. My father wasn't a visionary. He was a man drowning in his own lies. Even Patrick, who once idolized him, began avoiding his calls. Vivian started showing up less at the office, her loyalty evaporating as the money bled away. Nancy helped me draft a restructuring plan, new audits, employee protections, transparency reports. For the first time, people at the company looked at me with respect, not pity. But with every step forward, my father grew more unhinged. He'd show up unannounced, red-eyed and trembling, shouting that I was ruining everything he'd built. I tried to reason with him. Dad, it doesn't have to be this way. We can fix it together. He spat back. There is no we. You're a traitor, Camilla. You've turned my life's work into a circus. There was no reaching him anymore. His pride was eating him alive, and just when I thought I'd seen the worst of his retaliation, just when I believed the storm was finally passing, he did something I never expected, something so cruel, so personal, that it almost broke me completely. And just when I thought I'd seen the worst of his retaliation, my father made a move so cruel, it almost broke me completely. It wasn't just business anymore. My father's war turned personal, and he decided if he couldn't win legally, he'd ruin my life another way. The first sign came quietly, an email notification in the middle of the night. It was from a company account, flagged as urgent. When I opened it, I froze. Attached were internal files from our private servers, contracts, payroll data, confidential communications, all posted publicly on a forum known for leaking corporate secrets. My name was plastered across the headlines in bold letters. Whitmore heiress exposes private employee data. I stared at the screen in disbelief. My father had accused me of fraud before, but this was different. This was character assassination. Within hours, journalists began calling my office. The company's website crashed from traffic. Employees demanded answers, and the board was in chaos again. I called Nancy in a panic. "It's all over the internet," I said. "Files, signatures, everything. They're saying I leaked it." She sighed heavily. "We both know you didn't, which means someone with inside access did." "Someone like my father?" "Yes," she said grimly. "He's capable of this, but we'll need proof before we make any move." The following week was a blur of chaos. I barely slept. My inbox flooded with threats, angry emails, and demands for my resignation. News outlets ran story after story about Whitmore family scandal. And then came the audits, conveniently timed, invasive, and relentless. Every one of my accounts, personal and business, was flagged for review by the state financial authority. Coincidence? Not with my father's connections. When I called Nancy again, she said what I feared most. "Gerald's influence runs deep, Camilla. He knows the right people in the right offices. He can't beat you in court, so he's trying to drown you in suspicion." I wanted to believe the truth would clear my name, but the public doesn't wait for truth. They want scandal. They want blood. Then came the article, the one that nearly broke me. It was published in a local business journal under the headline, "Whitmore Daughter Diverts Millions, Family in Turmoil." It accused me of stealing company funds and funneling them into personal accounts overseas. The sources were unnamed, but the narrative was clear. I was a criminal. When I showed Nancy the piece, her face hardened. "He's setting you up. He's trying to create a paper trail that makes it look like you're unstable and corrupt." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Nothing. Don't feed it. Don't post. Don't respond. Don't engage. We'll let the evidence speak." But silence was harder than I expected. Every minute felt like drowning, watching my reputation crumble in real time while pretending I was calm. I stopped eating. Sleep became a stranger. My chest tightened so often that I started keeping a bottle of medication in my pocket. Panic attacks came without warning. One night, I woke up from a nightmare convinced someone was in the house. My mind played tricks on me, fueled by stress and fear. I'd never felt more alone. Then Patrick called. He started with fake sympathy. "Camilla, look, Dad's upset. He didn't mean for things to go this far. Maybe if you just apologize publicly, we could fix this." "Apologize? For what? Existing?" "Come on," he said softly. "You've made a mess. People are talking. You're hurting the company." That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound. The kind you only notice if you're listening for it. He was recording me. "Patrick," I said sharply. "You're on speaker, aren't you?" He went silent, then hung up. That call confirmed it. They were building a case, or at least the illusion of one. Everyone I thought I could trust vanished overnight. Colleagues stopped answering my calls. Even friends avoided me. It was like being erased from my own life. I realized I couldn't just defend myself. I had to go on offense. So I started recording everything. Every message, every voicemail, every document my father's team sent. I even installed cameras outside my home. If he wanted a war, I'd show him I knew how to fight. Nancy worked tirelessly. One evening she called me, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and relief. "Camilla, we've got it." "Got what?" "Proof. Gerald used company funds to hire a private IT contractor, the same one who leaked those files online. We traced the payments. It's undeniable." I sat there in stunned silence. "So he did this?" I whispered. "Yes, he weaponized his own business to destroy you, but now we can expose him." We planned everything carefully, a press conference where we'd reveal the truth, the documents, the payments, and the fraud. It would destroy what was left of his public image. But there was no other way. Nancy warned me, "Once this goes live, there's no turning back. You'll win the battle, but you'll end your relationship with your father forever." I nodded. That relationship ended the moment he tried to ruin my life. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. The nightmare was about to end, one way or another. But life, it seems, loves cruel timing. The night before the press conference, my phone rang. It was Patrick. His voice was shaking. "Camilla," he said. "Dad." He collapsed. My heart stopped. "What do you mean collapsed?" "They think it was a heart attack. He's in the ICU." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. After everything, the war, the lies, the hatred, I wasn't ready for this. The night before the press conference, I got a call. My father had collapsed. Hearing that my father was in the ICU should have filled me with relief, but instead, I felt something unexpected. Sorrow. When Patrick told me over the phone that Dad had collapsed, the world seemed to narrow into a blur of noise and disbelief. All the anger, all the bitterness, everything that had driven us apart suddenly felt small, fragile. I drove to the hospital in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers ached, trying to prepare myself for what I might see. The hospital's sterile brightness hit me like a wall. The hum of machines, the muted chatter of nurses, the distant beeping from monitors in rooms filled with stories like ours. I gave my name to the nurse at the desk, and she pointed me toward the intensive care unit. My legs felt heavy with every step. When I entered the ICU, Patrick and Vivian were already there. Patrick stood rigid by the window, his face pale and hollow. Vivian sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, though even in her grief, she looked composed, immaculate. The moment they saw me, the temperature in the room dropped. "What are you doing here?" Patrick snapped. His voice was sharp, raw from exhaustion and anger. "I came to see him," I said softly. "You've done enough," Vivian murmured, her tone dripping with accusation. "You wanted to destroy him, and now look what's happened." I ignored her. My eyes drifted toward the hospital bed, and for a moment I couldn't move. My father, Gerald Whitmore, the man who once ruled boardrooms and terrified executives, lay motionless beneath a thin white blanket. His skin was pale, his hands trembling faintly from the pulse of machines keeping him alive. The strong, commanding voice that once filled every room was replaced by the rhythmic hiss of oxygen. The doctor entered quietly, clipboard in hand. "He suffered a massive heart attack," he explained. "We managed to stabilize him, but the damage is severe. The stress, it's taken a toll." The words hung in the air. I wanted to ask if he'd make it, but the look on the doctor's face said enough. After they left us alone, I moved closer to the bed and sat down. I studied his face, older, weaker, stripped of all the power he had used to define himself. For years, I had imagined this moment as one of triumph, but sitting there, all I felt was a hollow ache. I thought of every birthday he'd missed, every cruel word he'd said, every time he'd looked at me and seen disappointment instead of a daughter. But beneath all that pain, there was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Pity. "Hi, Dad," I whispered. My voice cracked. "You win. You always needed to win, didn't you?" He didn't move, didn't open his eyes. I knew he couldn't hear me, but I kept talking. Maybe I needed to hear it myself. "I wanted you to be proud of me," I said. "That's all I ever wanted. But you couldn't love anyone who didn't obey you. So I stopped trying." My throat tightened as tears filled my eyes. "I fought you because I had to, not because I wanted to. You taught me to survive, even if that meant surviving you." I reached for his hand. It felt cold, fragile, so unlike the iron grip that once ruled my childhood. "I forgive you," I whispered, "even if you never asked for it." Patrick suddenly turned, his eyes red and furious. "You don't get to forgive him," he hissed. "You killed him." "Patrick, that's not fair," I said, standing up. He stepped forward, his voice rising. "You took everything from him, the company, his reputation. You pushed him until his heart gave out." Vivian tugged at his sleeve, trying to calm him, but he jerked away and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind him, echoing down the sterile hallway. I stood there for a long time, unable to move. The monitor beside my father beeped steadily, each sound a cruel reminder that even now, our family was breaking apart piece by piece. Later that evening, Nancy called to check on me. When I told her what had happened, she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Camilla, if your father doesn't recover, the transfer of assets becomes permanent. You'll have full control." Her words felt heavy, almost unbearable. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I understand," I whispered. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, surrounded by silence, feeling the weight of both victory and loss pressing against my chest. I thought about Mom, how she must have foreseen this ending, how she tried to protect me from it. And I wondered, not for the first time, if revenge ever truly healed anything. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was the sound of my phone ringing. The sky outside was still gray, the sun barely rising. I answered groggily. "Hello?" It was Patrick. His voice was different now. Quiet, broken. "He's gone," he said. For a second, I couldn't process the words. "What?" "Dad. He didn't make it through the night." The world went silent. No tears came, just an emptiness so deep it felt endless. After everything he'd done, after all the hate between us, I'd thought his death would free me. But in that moment, it only left me with questions that would never be answered. And with his death, everything he tried to take from me officially became mine. When the inheritance papers cleared, I stood in the boardroom as the new head of the empire, and it felt both powerful and hollow. The process took weeks, though it felt like years. Lawyers, auditors, and judges combed through every document my father had left behind. But in the end, the truth was simple. Everything tied to his estate, the business, the assets, the properties, legally belonged to me. The court upheld the trust. The signatures were valid. The shares were mine. And just like that, I became CEO of Whitmore Real Estate Holdings, the company that had once been my father's entire identity. The day it became official, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines read, "Whitmore heiress takes control after patriarch's death." Others called it the most dramatic succession in the state's history. The reporters swarmed the company entrance, desperate to capture a glimpse of me, the daughter who had fought her father and won. But as I stood in that boardroom, facing the portraits of men who had built legacies on domination and greed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the weight of generations pressing down on my shoulders. This empire wasn't built on pride or brilliance, it was built on fear. My father had ruled through intimidation, and for decades people obeyed because they were too scared not to. Now they were looking to me. The first board meeting under my leadership was unlike any before. The air, once thick with fear, now felt cautious, but hopeful. The executives waited for me to speak. I could almost hear my father's ghost whispering in my ear, telling me not to show weakness. But I ignored that voice. "I'm not here to be my father," I said. "I'm here to rebuild what he broke. This company will stand for integrity, transparency, and compassion, the values my mother believed in." There was a pause. Then slowly, people began to nod. Over the next few months, I worked tirelessly. I audited every department, exposed every lie buried in the books, and restructured the company from the ground up. We paid back vendors my father had cheated, reinstated employees he'd wrongfully fired, and made sure every project followed ethical standards. For the first time in years, the company wasn't a fortress of fear. It was a workplace filled with gratitude. Even the employees who had once avoided eye contact with me began to smile when I passed. I learned their names. I listened. And in those small gestures, I started to feel something my father never understood: respect freely given. Patrick, of course, didn't take it well. He filed a formal challenge against the will, claiming that I had coerced our mother or falsified documents. It was a desperate move, and it failed spectacularly. The court dismissed his claim, citing overwhelming evidence in my favor. The day the verdict was announced, he refused to even look at me. He stormed out of the courthouse, muttering, "You've destroyed this family." I wanted to tell him the truth, that the family was already broken long before I ever fought back. But there was no point. Some wounds don't heal because the people who cause them never want them to. Vivian didn't put up a fight. She quietly sold off her jewelry, her cars, and eventually the penthouse my father had bought her. Within a month, she was gone. The gossip columns said she moved overseas, chasing a new benefactor. I didn't care enough to confirm it. Through all of it, Nancy remained by my side. What began as a professional partnership evolved into something deeper. She became my confidant, the one person who understood the loneliness that came with power. She told me once, Your mother would be proud, not because you won, but because you didn't become like him. That sentence stayed with me. Months later, when the chaos finally settled, I drove to the old cemetery where my mother was buried. The wind was cool that morning, carrying the scent of pine and rain. I brought her letter with me, the same one I'd found hidden in her jewelry box. The ink had faded, but the words still glowed with love. I read it one last time, tracing her handwriting with my fingertips. You were always meant to stand tall, Camilla. For the first time in a long time, I let myself cry. Not out of grief, but out of gratitude. She had believed in me when no one else did. And now I was finally living the life she'd wanted for me, one built on strength, not submission. Before I left, I placed the letter on her grave and whispered, "We did it, Mom." As the sun rose higher, the city skyline shimmered in the distance, the empire I now controlled, reborn under my name. Yet even as I stood there, I felt a quiet unease beneath the peace, because in families like ours, nothing ever truly stays buried. A few days later, that feeling proved right. One morning, I arrived at my office to find a small brown envelope waiting on my desk. There was no return address, just my name written in familiar handwriting. My father's attorney, Mr. Larkin. Inside was a single note. It read, "Your father left something for you. Something he wanted you to have only after everything was settled." I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Just when I thought it was finally over, the past had found one last way to reach me. Just when I thought it was over, I received a small brown envelope from my father's attorney with a message that would test everything I believed. Inside that envelope was my father's final letter, not of hate, but of confession. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise. Every curve of the ink still carried his presence, controlled, deliberate, proud. My hands trembled as I turned the envelope over. It was sealed with the embossed insignia of Larkin and Associates, my father's longtime attorneys. Beneath it, in his bold scrawl, were the words, "For Camilla, after everything." I called Mr. Larkin immediately. He agreed to meet in person, saying only that there were specific instructions about how the letter should be delivered. The next morning, I found myself sitting in his dimly lit office, surrounded by shelves of dusty legal volumes. The scent of leather and paper filled the air, a room frozen in time, much like my father himself. Mr. Larkin slid the envelope across the polished oak desk. "Your father wrote this a few weeks before his passing," he said softly. "He wanted it kept sealed until all estate matters were concluded. He was particular about that." I stared at the envelope. My pulse quickened. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. After everything he'd done, part of me didn't want to read it. I was afraid of his words, afraid they'd reopen wounds I had barely begun to heal. But finally, I drew a deep breath and broke the seal. It wasn't long, just 2 pages, handwritten on thick stationery, but every word cut through me like a confession from a man I thought I'd never understand. "Camilla," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I imagine you're not mourning me. I wouldn't blame you for that. I never made it easy to love me." I felt my throat tighten. He continued, "I spent my whole life building walls and calling them strength. I thought control was love and that fear was the same as respect. I told myself I was protecting this family, but the truth is, I was protecting my pride. Your mother saw it. You saw it. I just couldn't admit it." The tears came slowly at first, then harder. "I pushed you away because you reminded me of her, of the parts of her that I could never control. You had her eyes, her heart, her stubborn faith in people. I hated it because it made me feel small. But what I didn't tell you, what I couldn't tell you, was that I also admired you for it." My vision blurred as I tried to keep reading. "You were right to fight me. You were right to stand tall. I didn't say it then, but I was proud. Proud that you became someone I could never be. You made me see what legacy really means. It's not money or buildings or power. It's courage. It's decency. It's the ability to walk away from hate and not let it consume you." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears falling freely now. He ended with words I never thought I'd see from him. "You deserved more than I could ever give you. I hope you use what's mine to become what I never was." No signature. Just that final sentence, as if he'd said everything he needed to say. For a long while, I sat there in silence, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock in Mr. Larkin's office. I thought of my father as a young man, full of ambition and fear. I thought of my mother, patient and kind, trying to save him from himself. And then I thought of me, the daughter who finally broke the chain. The man who tormented me all my life had finally seen me for who I truly was. And in his final act, he'd done what I never thought possible. He gave me closure. That night, I went home and read the letter again, this time out loud. Each word felt like a piece of the past being laid to rest. I realized that holding on to anger would mean letting him win one last time. I wouldn't do that. So I made a decision. I used part of the company's wealth, his wealth, to start something new. The Whitmore Foundation for Women and Families, a charitable trust dedicated to helping women estranged from their families rebuild their lives. I wanted it to stand for the compassion my mother embodied and the redemption my father could never reach. In every story we helped write, I saw a piece of myself and, in some strange way, a piece of him. Months later, I found myself standing in my father's old office, now mine, the same place where he once humiliated me. The walls had been repainted, the old photographs replaced with my mother's artwork. The space felt lighter, alive. I looked out over the city skyline, the one he had ruled over for so long, and whispered, "I forgive you, Dad." The words didn't taste bitter. They tasted like freedom. Because my story wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about release. As I turned off the office lights that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the battles, the legacy left behind. And I realized something simple but profound. He had never destroyed me. He had shaped me. Every wound he gave me became a lesson in strength. Every insult he threw became a reason to stand taller. I smiled softly, holding the letter one last time before locking it away. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking everything they owned. It's becoming everything they said you never could be. In the end, I didn't just inherit my father's fortune. I inherited the strength he never recognized. What began as revenge turned into redemption, not just for me, but for every woman ever told she wasn't enough. My mother's love gave me courage. My father's cruelty gave me purpose. And now, when I look at everything I built, I know I became exactly what they said I never could. But tell me, if you were in my place, would you have forgiven him or walked away forever? Stories like this remind us that silence can be powerful, but justice spoken out loud can change everything. If this story touched something in your heart, maybe it found you for a reason. Stay with me for more stories that prove it's never too late to rise again and to rewrite your ending.